The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Harold Thompson's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his 1985 Buick. The car, much like its owner, was a testament to time, old but impeccably maintained, with a shine that spoke of daily care and attention. At exactly 6:45 a.m., Harold pulled out of his modest driveway, just as he had done every single day for the past 43 years. The streets of Springfield were quiet at this hour, save for the occasional delivery truck and early morning joggers who would wave as Harold drove past. They all knew his car, that distinctive pale blue Buick with the veteran's license plate that read WW2USN. Some even set their watches by his punctual morning drive. Rose's Diner sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, its neon sign flickering to life just as Harold's car approached. The brick building hadn't changed much since 1978, when Harold first stepped through its doors, except for maybe a few touch-ups to the red and white striped awning. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon always seemed to find its way to the parking lot, greeting customers before the bell above the door could announce their arrival. Inside, the morning ritual began like a well-rehearsed dance. Sally, the waitress who had been there almost as long as Harold had been a customer, would already have his usual spot ready, the 3rd booth from the door, where he could see both the street and the counter. The vinyl seats, cracked in places but still comfortable, seemed to welcome him like an old friend. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Sally would call out, her voice carrying the warmth of decades of familiarity. She never needed to take his order anymore. Before Harold could even settle into his seat, a steaming cup of black coffee would appear, accompanied by 2 slices of perfectly toasted wheat bread, butter on the side. The other regulars, Tom the mailman, Betty from the flower shop, and old Joe who ran the hardware store, would nod respectfully as Harold made his way to his booth. They had all heard pieces of his story over the years, though Harold rarely spoke about his past. Sometimes, if you looked closely, you could catch him staring at the old black and white photos on the diner's wall of heroes, where his own young face smiled back from behind dusty glass, dressed in his naval uniform from 1944. Harold would carefully unfold his newspaper, smoothing out the creases with hands that had once manned battleship guns and later guided countless young soldiers to safety. His fingers, though now gnarled with arthritis, still moved with surprising precision as he turned the pages, methodically reading each section while taking small sips of his coffee. The morning light would stream through the large windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor and highlighting the silver in Harold's neatly combed hair. His pressed clothes and polished shoes reflected the military discipline that had never left him, even after all these years. A small American flag pin, worn daily on his collar, caught the light and sparkled like a tiny beacon. Regular customers had learned to appreciate the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from his corner of the diner. Children would often stare, fascinated by his perfect posture and the mysterious array of medals he wore on special occasions. Parents would whisper to them about respect and service, using Harold as an example of the greatest generation. Few people knew that behind his gentle smile and quiet demeanor lay stories that would make even the bravest souls pause. Tales of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty that had earned him not just medals, but the enduring respect of those who knew his true history. For now, though, he was content to be known simply as Mr. Thompson, the elderly gentleman who started each day at Rose's Diner with his coffee, toast, and newspaper. The peaceful mornings at Rose's Diner changed the day 10 motorcycles roared into the parking lot, their engines drowning out the gentle music playing inside. The riders were young, wearing leather jackets with a crudely designed logo, a snarling wolf with Road Warriors written in jagged letters. Their arrival sent ripples of unease through the diner's regular customers. At first, they just occupied the far corner of the parking lot, leaving cigarette butts and empty beer cans scattered on the ground. Sally would frown each morning as she swept up their mess before opening time. The other customers started parking farther away, avoiding the area where the bikers gathered. But Harold, steadfast in his routine, continued to park in his usual spot. The trouble began small. One morning, Harold found a half-eaten burger smashed against his windshield. Another day, someone had spit on his driver's side window. Sally offered to have her son clean it, but Harold quietly took care of it himself, his weathered hand steady as he wiped away the disrespect without a word of complaint. The bikers seemed to take Harold's dignity as a challenge. They started timing their arrivals to coincide with his, revving their engines so loudly that the diner's windows would rattle. Their leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, would mock Harold's careful way of walking. "Watch out, boys," he'd sneer. "Grandpa's trying to break a speed record getting from his car to the door." Old Joe from the hardware store tried to intervene one morning, but the bikers just laughed and made rude gestures behind his back. Betty from the flower shop called the police, but the bikers were always gone before any patrol cars arrived. They seemed to know exactly how far they could push without crossing legal lines. The diner's atmosphere changed. The morning chatter grew quieter, tense. Regular customers started checking the parking lot before pulling in, some choosing to leave if the motorcycles were there. Tom the mailman began parking his truck to block the bikers' view of Harold's car, but they just found other ways to make their presence felt. One particular morning, they lined their bikes up in a row, taking up 4 parking spaces, including Harold's usual spot. They lounged against their motorcycles, making exaggerated saluting gestures when Harold's Buick appeared. "Ten Hut," they called out mockingly, laughing as Harold had to park at the far end of the lot. Sally watched through the window, her hands twisting her apron in worry, as Harold made his way slowly across the parking lot. The distance was considerably longer than his usual short walk, and his cane slipped slightly on some loose gravel. The bikers snickered, one of them making a show of timing Harold's walk on his phone. What the road warriors didn't notice was the way Harold's eyes carefully studied each of them. They missed how his gaze lingered on their bike's license plates, or how he noted the name stitched on their leader's jacket. They didn't see him pulling out a small notebook after settling into his booth, writing down details with the same precision he had once used to record military intelligence. The diner's regular customers saw a vulnerable old man being harassed. They didn't know that behind Harold's calm exterior, a strategic mind was working. The same mind that had once planned complex military operations. While the bikers congratulated themselves on their petty victories, Harold was quietly gathering information, waiting for the right moment. Even when one of them knocked over his cane accidentally as he was leaving, Harold simply picked it up, brushed it off, and gave them a smile that would have worried anyone who truly knew him. Because Harold Thompson hadn't survived war and commanded troops by being helpless, he had learned long ago that timing and intelligence were more powerful than brute force, and he was about to teach the road warriors a lesson they wouldn't forget. The situation at Rose's diner grew darker as autumn approached. The road warriors, emboldened by Harold's apparent helplessness, became more aggressive with each passing day. The snake-tattooed leader, who everyone now knew as Viper, seemed to take personal pleasure in finding new ways to torment the elderly veteran. One chilly morning, Harold arrived to find his usual parking spot blocked not by motorcycles, but by a collection of trash bags torn open and scattered across the pavement. Coffee grounds, leftover food, and wet paper created a disgusting mess that would ruin his polished shoes if he tried to walk through it. The bikers lounged nearby, pretending to be absorbed in their phones while secretly watching for his reaction. Sally rushed out with a broom, her face red with anger, but Harold gently touched her arm. "It's all right, Sally," he said softly, though something in his eyes had changed. The usual warmth was replaced by a calculating look that reminded Sally of her father, also a veteran, just before he dealt with a neighborhood bully years ago. The harassment escalated throughout the week. They would circle his car on their motorcycles while he tried to leave, forcing him to wait as they played their dangerous game. One of them, a younger member with spiked green hair, started taking photos of Harold, posting them online with mocking captions about dinosaurs who should be in museums. The final straw came on a particularly cold Thursday morning. Harold had just gotten out of his car when three of the bikers approached him. Viper led the group, swaggering with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. As Harold reached for his cane in the backseat, Viper snatched it away. "Hey boys, look what I found," Viper called out, holding the cane like a baseball bat. "Think the old-timer needs this." The others laughed as their leader began tossing the cane from hand to hand, making Harold watch as his support was turned into a prop for their amusement. What happened next caught everyone by surprise. Harold straightened up, and despite his age, something in his posture changed. The slight stoop disappeared, his shoulders squared, and his eyes took on a steely glint that made even Viper pause for a moment. "Son," Harold said, his voice carrying across the parking lot with unexpected authority, "you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life." The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Several of the younger bikers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unsure of themselves. Viper, though, wasn't ready to back down. He twirled the cane one more time, then held it horizontally in both hands. "Oh yeah, old man, what are you going to do about it?" With a cruel smile, he began to bend the cane, testing its strength. The crack of splintering wood echoed through the parking lot. Sally, watching from the diner window, gasped. Tom the mailman was already reaching for his phone to call the police, but Harold didn't flinch. Instead, a small, almost pitying smile crossed his face. "That cane," Harold said quietly, "was a gift from the men of Charlie Company, 3rd Special Forces Group. It was made from wood taken from a battlefield where we lost good men." He took a step forward, and despite being shorter and older than Viper, somehow seemed to tower over him. "But breaking it isn't your biggest mistake. Your biggest mistake was assuming that because I use a cane, I'm helpless." Harold reached slowly into his coat pocket. The bikers tensed, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small flip phone. An old model that looked like it had seen years of use. "You see, son, some of us old-timers, we still keep in touch." His fingers moved over the keypad with practiced ease. "And we still believe in teaching lessons to those who need them." The phone's antenna extended with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. None of the bikers moved as Harold raised the phone to his ear, their bravado evaporating as they realized that perhaps they had pushed too far, and this seemingly frail old man might not be as vulnerable as they had assumed. The atmosphere in Rose's Diner's parking lot crackled with tension as Harold held the phone to his ear. Rain had started to fall, light drops creating a gentle percussion on the scattered motorcycles. Viper still clutched the broken pieces of the cane, but his knuckles had turned white, and the confident smirk had vanished from his face. "Morning, Jack," Harold spoke into the phone, his voice carrying the warmth of old friendship. "Remember that conversation we had about Operation Homecoming? Well, son, I think it's time." He paused, listening, then added, "Yes, at Rose's. You know the place." The phone clicked shut with a quiet finality that somehow seemed louder than the rumble of distant thunder. Viper tried to recover his swagger, tossing the broken cane pieces aside. "Ooh, making phone calls now, Grandpa. Calling your bingo buddies for backup." But his voice cracked slightly, betraying his unease. Something about the old man's calm demeanor had shifted the power dynamic in the parking lot. The other bikers were starting to fidget. The green-haired one who had been taking mocking photos was now nervously trying to delete them from his phone. Another kept glancing at his motorcycle, as if calculating how quickly he could reach it. They had expected an easy morning of harassment, not this strange standoff with an old man who suddenly didn't seem so helpless. Harold simply walked to his usual booth, each step measured and deliberate. Sally hurried over with his coffee, her hand shaking slightly as she poured. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, "should I call the police?" Harold patted her hand gently. "No need, Sally. Let's just give it about 30 minutes." The bikers huddled near their motorcycles, arguing in harsh whispers. Some wanted to leave, but Viper insisted they couldn't let an old man scare them off. "He's probably just bluffing," Viper declared, but he kept glancing nervously at his phone, checking the time. 20 minutes passed. The rain grew heavier, but none of the bikers moved to leave. There was something in Harold's quiet confidence that kept them rooted in place, like mice that had suddenly realized they'd been playing with a cat. Through the diner's window, they could see him calmly sipping his coffee, reading his newspaper as if nothing unusual was happening. Then came the sound. At first it was just a low rumble in the distance, barely distinguishable from the thunder. But it grew steadily louder, a deep rhythmic growling that seemed to come from all directions. The road warriors looked around, confused, until the first bikes appeared through the rain. These weren't the flashy sport bikes the road warriors rode. These were serious machines, massive cruisers and touring bikes, many bearing military insignia and combat unit emblems. And they kept coming, bike after bike, until the road was filled with them. The riders were a mix of ages. Some looked like Vietnam-era veterans. Others were clearly younger, fresh from more recent conflicts. But they all moved with the same purposeful precision that Harold had shown. Their faces were stern, eyes hidden behind rain-streaked visors, but their body language spoke volumes. Viper's face had gone pale. One of his gang members whispered something that sounded like, "We should go," but before any of them could move, they found themselves surrounded. The new arrivals hadn't said a word, hadn't made a single threatening gesture. They simply positioned their bikes in a circle around the road warriors, engines idling with a sound like contained thunder. Inside the diner, Harold folded his newspaper neatly and took one last sip of coffee. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door. Sally watched him move, noticing that without his cane, his steps were surprisingly steady. As he pushed open the diner's door, the bell's cheerful jingle seemed almost comically out of place in the tense atmosphere. The rain continued to fall, but no one moved. The road warriors stood frozen, their earlier bravado washed away by the realization that they had gravely misunderstood who they'd been dealing with. And Harold, the old man they'd thought was an easy target, walked out into the rain to greet his reinforcements, each step radiating the quiet authority of a man who had faced far worse things than parking lot bullies. The first person to step forward from the crowd of newly arrived bikers was a tall man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and a weathered face. He walked straight to Harold, snapped a crisp salute, and said, "Colonel Thompson, 2nd Battalion, Special Forces, reporting as requested, sir." The title Colonel seemed to hang in the air, causing several of the road warriors to exchange nervous glances. More veterans dismounted their bikes, each moving with the disciplined grace that comes from years of military service. They formed a loose semicircle, their presence commanding without a single threatening gesture. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and steam rose from their bikes' hot engines, creating an almost mystical atmosphere. "Jack," Harold smiled, returning the salute. "Good to see you, son. How's your father doing?" The casual conversation between the two men somehow made the situation even more intimidating for the road warriors. This wasn't just some random group of bikers. This was a brotherhood, a family forged in combat and maintained through decades of loyalty. From the diner's window, Sally and the other regulars watched in amazement as more veterans arrived. Some wore leather jackets decorated with combat medals. Others had unit patches and campaign ribbons. One elderly man, who must have been close to Harold's age, wore a jacket with Normandy Survivor emblazoned on the back. Viper, trying to salvage some dignity, stepped forward. "Look, we didn't know," he began, but Jack cut him off with a raised hand. "No, you didn't know. That's exactly the problem." His voice was calm but carried an edge of steel. "You didn't know that the man you've been harassing is Colonel Harold Thompson, one of the most decorated Special Forces commanders in post-World War I history." Another veteran stepped forward, this one younger, probably in his 40s. "You didn't know that he led the mission that rescued my father's entire unit in Vietnam," he said quietly. or that he came out of retirement to train Special Forces operators for Desert Storm. More veterans began to speak up, each adding to Harold's story. "Saved my brother's life in '68, called one. "Taught me everything I know about survival," added another. "Helped me get through PTSD when nobody else could," said a third. Each testimony made the road warriors shrink further into themselves. The green-haired biker who had taken the mocking photos suddenly looked at his phone with horror, realizing he had been publicly ridiculing a man who was practically a legend in military circles. He frantically began deleting posts, his hands shaking. Harold watched this all quietly, then raised his hand for silence. The veterans immediately fell quiet. The instinct to follow his commands hadn't faded with time. He walked over to where the pieces of his broken cane lay in a puddle. Jack quickly moved to pick them up, handling the fragments with reverence. "That cane," Harold said, his voice carrying across the parking lot, "was made from a tree that stood in a village in Vietnam. We lost good men defending that village from being overrun. The villagers gave me that wood as a thank you, and my men had it made into a cane when my knees started giving out." He paused, looking directly at Viper. It wasn't just a walking stick. It was a reminder of sacrifice, courage, and the price of freedom. The silence that followed was profound. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The road warriors looked at the broken pieces of the cane with new understanding, the full weight of their actions finally sinking in. What they had seen as a simple act of bullying had been a desecration of something sacred. A young veteran wheeled his bike forward, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out another cane, this one made of polished oak with military insignias carefully carved into its length. "We figured something like this might happen someday, Colonel," he said, presenting it to Harold. The men took up a collection. "This one's reinforced with a steel core. Should last a bit longer." The message was clear. Harold wasn't just protected by these men. He was revered by them. And while he might appear to be a gentle old man having his morning coffee, he commanded a respect and loyalty that no amount of parking lot intimidation could ever match. The revelation of Harold's identity was just the beginning. As the morning sun broke through the clouds, one by one, the veterans began sharing stories that painted a picture of a man whose quiet demeanor had hidden an extraordinary life of service and sacrifice. Jack pulled out an old, creased photograph from his wallet. In it, a younger Harold stood amid a group of soldiers in jungle fatigues, his face streaked with camouflage paint, but wearing the same calm expression he carried today. "This was taken after the Mekong Delta operation," Jack explained, showing it to the now silent road warriors. "Colonel Thompson led a rescue mission that nobody else would take. Saved 37 men that day." The green-haired biker, who had been furiously deleting his mocking social media posts, froze when he saw the photo. His uncle had been stationed in the Mekong Delta, and he'd grown up hearing stories about a miraculous rescue that seemed almost too incredible to be true. That was you," he stammered, looking at Harold with new eyes. Another veteran, a woman in her 40s wearing a Desert Storm cap, stepped forward. "When I was going through Special Forces training," she said, "Colonel Thompson was brought in as a special instructor. Everyone said it was impossible for a woman to pass the course." She smiled at Harold. "He was the only one who told me that impossible just means it hasn't been done yet." Viper, who had been trying to maintain some semblance of his tough guy image, couldn't help but listen as more stories emerged. Tales of Harold leading missions behind enemy lines, of him carrying wounded men to safety on his own back, of him standing up to superior officers when they made decisions that would needlessly risk soldiers' lives. "But the real amazing thing," said an older veteran with a silver beard, "wasn't just his courage in combat. It was what he did after." He turned to the road warriors. "You know that Veterans Rehabilitation Center on Pine Street? The one that's helped hundreds of vets deal with PTSD and get back on their feet." The bikers nodded. Everyone in town knew the place. Colonel Thompson founded that, used his own pension to get it started. Sally, who had come outside to hear the stories, suddenly remembered something. Every Christmas, anonymous donations would arrive at the diner, paying for veterans' meals for the entire year. She looked at Harold, who gave her a slight nod, confirming her suspicion about the source of those donations. A younger veteran, wearing a modern combat patch, spoke up next. 2 years ago, my unit was deployed overseas. Colonel Thompson wrote to every single one of us every week. When Johnson lost his legs in an IED blast, the colonel was there at the hospital before his own family could arrive, sat with him through every surgery. The road warriors' faces showed a mix of shame and awe as they learned about the man they'd been tormenting. The veteran who'd brought the new cane stepped forward again, addressing them directly. You thought you were picking on a helpless old man. Instead, you were messing with a man who spent his entire life protecting others, including the freedom that lets you ride those bikes and act tough in parking lots. Harold, who had been quietly listening to all these stories about himself, finally raised his hand for silence. The gathered crowd immediately fell quiet, not from fear, but from deep respect. He looked at each of the road warriors in turn, his gaze neither angry nor condemning, but filled with something that felt like disappointment mixed with hope. The thing about respect, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of leadership, is that it's not about age or strength or how loud your motorcycle can be. He gestured to the gathered veterans. These men and women, they don't respect me because I was their commander. They respect me because I respected them first, because I saw their worth as human beings, not just as soldiers. The parking lot had become completely still, every person hanging on Harold's words. Even the morning traffic on the streets seemed to have quieted. The moment felt like a turning point, not just for the road warriors, but for everyone present. A lesson about judgment, respect, and the quiet strength that truly commands loyalty. The transformation that happened next in Rose's Diner's parking lot was something nobody would ever forget. Viper, the tough guy who had led weeks of harassment, took off his leather jacket with trembling hands. Underneath, he wore a faded T-shirt with a military logo, his father's unit from Vietnam. My dad, Viper's voice cracked as he spoke. He never came back from his last mission. I was just a kid. He looked at Harold, tears now visible in his eyes. He always said there were real heroes out there, men who led from the front. I guess I forgot what that meant, got lost somewhere along the way. The other road warriors began sharing their own connections. The guy with spiked green hair had an uncle who'd served. Another had a sister in Afghanistan. Somehow, in their attempt to act tough, they'd lost sight of their own connections to the military community they'd been disrespecting. Harold walked over to Viper, using his new cane with dignity. Son, he said gently, your father was in the 173rd Airborne, wasn't he? I can tell from the logo. When Viper nodded, Harold continued. I knew him. James Sullivan. Brave man, excellent soldier. He saved my life, once in '69. Viper's legs seemed to give out, and he sat heavily on his motorcycle seat. You knew my dad. The tough exterior had completely crumbled now, replaced by the look of a boy who had never stopped missing his father. Come by the Veterans Center tomorrow, Harold said. I have some photos you might want to see. Stories you should hear about your father. He looked at the other road warriors. All of you, come. Maybe it's time you found a better way to use all that energy and brotherhood you've built. Jack stepped forward with a suggestion. We have a motorcycle club that escorts military funerals, provides security for veterans events, and helps with PTSD support groups. Could always use some younger riders. The offer hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds. The change in the road warriors was immediate and profound. They began picking up their scattered trash from previous days, apologizing to Sally for the trouble they'd caused. The green-haired biker offered to repaint the diner's fence he'd scratched with his bike. Another promised to help fix the parking lot's potholes. Inside the diner, regular customers watched in amazement as former tormentors transformed into respectful young men. Sally brought out coffee for everyone, And soon the parking lot turned into an impromptu gathering of generations of veterans and their families, sharing stories and building new connections. A week later, Harold's usual parking spot had a fresh coat of paint and a new sign, reserved for Colonel Thompson, American hero. But more significantly, the spot next to it often held a row of motorcycles, not the road warriors anymore, but the Veterans Guard, as they now called themselves, with Viper and his friends proudly wearing new patches showing their support for military families. Every morning, Harold would arrive at his usual time, now often greeted by former troublemakers who would snap respectful salutes. They'd share coffee, learn about military history, and plan their next charity ride or veteran support event. The broken cane had been framed and hung in the diner, not as a reminder of past wrongs, but as a symbol of how understanding can bridge any divide. Sally noticed that Harold seemed to stand a little straighter these days, even without his cane. Perhaps it was the weight of secrecy lifted from his shoulders, or maybe it was the satisfaction of turning enemies into allies. The diner had become more than just his morning coffee spot. It was now a place where the next generation of veteran supporters gathered to learn from a man who had never stopped serving, even long after he'd hung up his uniform. The story of the 93-year-old veteran and the reformed bikers spread through the town, then beyond. It became a testament to the power of respect, understanding, and the unbreakable bonds of military brotherhood. But more than that, it showed that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from turning them into friends.